Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our monthly meetups. We have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop to learn about all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up today at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, our guest is Dan Doty, a leading voice for helping men and fathers to connect, to be better versions of themselves. Dan is best known as a founder of Evryman, which began as a group of men trying to help each other. It boomed, leading Dan and his co-founders to be covered by major media that range from the New York Times to the Today Show to the Joe Rogan Experience. He operates at the intersection of masculinity, fatherhood, and spirituality. And now he's on to something new, Fatherhood Unlocked, which begins with a podcast and goes from there. He also hosts a Thursday online meetup called Father's Fire. He's a married father of 3, 2 sons, and a daughter. Dan, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Happy to be here, Paul. Nowhere I'd rather be today.
I love it. You know, you didn't grow up on the coast. You grew up, you kind of, as you say, a real connection to nature. Talk a little bit about that, but really talk about, when you look back on the path of your life from the childhood, some of those early jobs you had, what led you to start Evryman?
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in a very small agricultural town in North Dakota on the border of Canada, and it was flat, culturally flat, geographically flat, and cold. It was very cold. And
do you know that, Dan, that North Dakota is the least visited state of the 50 states?
I mean, yeah.
Is that why you don't live there anymore? You want people to visit?
Yeah, the three of us that lived there, most of us left. So I grew up in a very small, loving family, right? I have one brother and parents who are still together today, and had a lot of what I would conceive of as idyllic setting for growing up, right? And what really moved me in my young years, I guess one thing was I stumbled into martial arts, which was a really big deal for me. But even more important than that, I got invited to go on a wilderness trip with my cousin's church group when I was 11 or 12. And we went to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, and it was like a full week. And it just, even if I kind of just let myself remember that a little bit, it completely changed my concept of the world and who I am. And that actually became a real theme for me in my life, of stumbling into something that I was completely unaware of, that just sort of opened up my perception in a really big way.
When you say that, like, what was the 11-year-old Dan like before he went on that trip, and how did you return? Like, how did it change?
Yeah. Really simple. I was really simple, right? Like I was a bookworm. I was fairly meek and shy. I grew up as a mama's boy. And martial arts have helped tease some of that out of me. But what that trip did for me was just, I don't know. It was like going from, I forget what movie it is. It's a Truman Show or something, but a black and white existence to just sort of being just so passionately in love with life. And just the simplicity and the wildness, really just the wildness of not being in a little box of any sort, and being in connection to. I also fell in love with one of the the other students, this girl named May. So I always sort of joke that I had my first 2 massive love affairs of my life at 11, and it sparked this life source inside of me, right? And it just sparked this sense of something so much more visceral and real, not real, that's not the right word, but visceral and felt, being a part of something much larger. And I'll jump ahead in years. Yeah. So I went to college in Minnesota, and kind of got lucky. I did some international travel as part of my university experience, and that really opened up my worldview in a large way. I'm very grateful for that. But right after college, I was actually living in Panama. My girlfriend at the time was getting her student teaching credentials in an abroad, a school abroad, and ran out of money and went on Craigslist in the internet cafe and found an ad for a job that was a wilderness therapy guide. And I didn't know what it was, had never heard of it, but it felt interesting and exciting to me. And then fast forward just 2 months later, and I am carrying a backpack made out of sticks and elk hide with a group of 10, 14 to 16-year-old boys who've been sent away from their home because of just many different reasons of being dysfunctional within their family and school and community. And literally found myself in that moment sort of watching as my life's path gets paved in front of me. And so this experience becoming my first real professional sort of move outside of college had everything to do with the wilderness and being immersed in wild places, but also just finding this like natural and very full passion for supporting boys. And part of that work also involved being present while fathers came in to be with their boys and go on these week-long father-son experiences. And I'm moving fairly quickly through this story on purpose, but that, the overlap there, that nexus of being involved in really just being a professional mentor, being a
Yeah.
professional older brother, it both offered me an opportunity to start to get a sense of who I actually was, but gave me just these like very clear directives for myself and where I wanted to go with my life.
So then it was totally natural that when you fast forward, X number of years in your life, you'd end up living in New York City, right? All this wilderness experience, that's exactly where you'd end up being.
Well, it is tied in, right? So I took that part of my life, like that was my adventure. My early and mid 20s were full of guiding groups like this in different wilderness locations, northern Minnesota, Montana, Utah,
Yeah.
international as well. And it was perfect. In my off time, I would travel around the world and just have adventures, and it was like the perfect. I can't imagine now looking back a more fruitful and fulfilling, sort of way to start to become an adult. And but it also had a ceiling on it, right? Being a wilderness guide is not the type of career you plan to do for 30 years, right? And I found myself at a juncture wanting to get a higher degree. I wanted to get a master's or PhD. And I thought very long and hard between a clinical route, becoming a therapist, and then also becoming an educator. And I chose the educator route. And the most exciting opportunity for me to tackle that was to become a New York City teaching fellow. So I moved to the South Bronx and went to school at Pace University, downtown Manhattan, and taught for a couple of years in that system. And it was wildly beneficial, and it broke me at the same time, right? It was very intense, and going to school at night and being a
Sure.
brand new teacher in a city in a high school in the Bronx in the day, it took its toll. And there's kind of a cool tie-in here though too, which is that in the midst of that tenure being a teacher, and especially towards the end, like it really did. Call it a quarter life crisis, call it just getting really burnt out, call it just me, I don't know, finding my own habits and bad habits coming, too far to the forefront. But in that process at the end, I did leave. I left after 2 years, but in that process, I found my first men's group, which started to tie a lot of my world together. I found a meditation group, a sangha, started seeing a therapist, and really started taking my own internal landscape seriously, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And But you're doing all kinds of other stuff. You produce a show at one point called Meat Eater, but it's a fascinating backstory. Um, and you're I say this in the best possible way, a complex man, but it all leads to Evryman, which is how a lot of people know Dan. How does
Yeah.
Evryman come into existence?
Yeah. So I'll back this story up just for a second to say that when I was out in the wilderness, as a younger man doing that guiding work, um, I started to have a vision or I think vision's probably the best way to put it, or a sense of purpose that what I observed and experienced in those small groups of adolescent boys, and particularly with their fathers coming in, I just felt like I got a peek behind the curtains at one of a very clear society-wide um, truth or issue or problem, which is just the natural development of boys and men um, being stunted in a lot of ways. A lot of what I observed is just very, very fundamental parts of our life that traditionally in our larger meta culture are not where boys and men are shown or asked to develop. So I'm talking about things like our emotional capacity, our ability to give and receive love, our ability to honor what's true for us and communicate it to the outer world. And you know, I fast forwarded over this little note, but if you could imagine, you know, these young men being sent away from home and their fathers getting on a flight and stopping at REI and hiking out into the desert, there is a sort of intrinsic wall between father and son, is what I observed over and over and over, just of um, all of the things, just a lot that goes unsaid, a lot that goes unfelt, a lot that goes untransmitted. But in those experiences of being out there through the therapy and through just the wilderness sort of immersion, what can happen and what did happen repeatedly was that wall would break down. And you could imagine a 16-year-old tough guy, thug type kid breaking down and being held by his dad, and tears just being shed on both sides, and this real reclamation of sort of basic humanity between father and son, and those moments that I experienced really did truly sort of shift something inside of me, and so I, even from those days, I had this strong inner call and urge um, to share this, to somehow find a way to help men in their mental health and their ability to connect with their family. And as you might imagine, I mean, it was also very real for me. I think there was without knowing it at the time, there was a real longing to know who my dad was, a real desire to feel his love and communicate it, and all of these things. And so um, probably can't turn the volume on that. I mean, it's real, right? It was something that I unknowingly wanted and needed in my life as well. But then I was observing it in all of the people around me. So I had been tracking and intending. I guess when I was 27, I almost got a book deal. It was going to be called um, "How Not to Suck at Life: A Guy's Guide to Getting Your Shit Together." Right,
Which could
and
only
it,
be written by a 27-year-old, because in your 20s, I used to walk in a restaurant in my 20s, grab the wine list, and just start ordering. Now I'm like, I'll just have a glass of red wine, whatever you think, man. I don't know shit. But in my 20s, I knew everything.
yeah, yeah. So there was that moment, and when I found my first men's group in New York City in the midst of being a teacher, that was just another like it totally rung my bell, man. It's just like I was the youngest in the group. It was 10 guys that met every week. And it was the same type of thing that was happening around the fire out in the desert and out in the woods that I was doing for these young men. But then I stumbled into this. I'm like, my God, um, wait a minute, I could have this for myself. I could have guys to support me and push me and challenge me. And so that was a paradigm shifting experience for me. And so I dove in there. And you mentioned I did. I was the director and producer and eventually executive producer of a show called Meat Eater, which is a wilderness hunting and food based show, and lived a pretty wild, exciting life with that for a while. But all the while, I was training and practicing and learning to lead men's groups, and I had a knack for it, right? I think a lot because of my experience in the woods, like facilitating so many circles in the past. My colleagues and friends that were in these with me would really urge me to make a public offer with it, right? And I wanted that. I felt that was right for me, but it was also freaking terrifying, right? Like to sort of go public and share like the stance that men can be vulnerable, maybe need to be vulnerable, that we have feelings, that there's this other capacity inside of us that's generally unlocked, right? And it was scary. And so I made my way up in the ranks of this media company, well-known media company, and kind of timing landed out. My first son was born in 2016. I ended up getting fired from my job a month later. And 2 months later, we invited the first group of 40 guys into a barn in the Berkshires. And I led our first retreat. And it landed, and we were off to the races.
And you and I have talked in the past about this. It landed. You were indeed off to the races, and you had
Yeah.
sort of a bullet train path forward, which again, from the outside looks amazing. But what was it like, being inside of that train, driving that train, knowing that you're doing a lot of helpful work, but you have a son, you have a wife, you have, a life, you have financial
Yeah.
obligations,
It was the best times and it was the worst times, like 100%. It
That's a
was
good way to start a book, you know that?
the actual work itself was brilliant. I mean, it was just we had so I had befriended and kind of been taking the under the wings of a mentor. His name's Owen Marcus, who ended up being one of the co-founders of that company. And he'd been doing men's work and men's retreats and groups for decades. And right. So, and it kind of devised a methodology that was simple and very effective. And so he and I really collaborated and worked together. And so, we would regularly, I don't know, sometimes 5-6 times a year bring, it ended up being 80 guys. We would often do 80 guys at a retreat. And I mean, we just sort of kickstarted this grassroots movement of, there was so much energy. I think the zeitgeist at the moment too, right? It was right as the Me Too movement was kicking off. There was just a lot of, it felt like a right time in the world for something like this. And yeah, the media picked us up very quickly. And it was, it felt like in some ways, just this incredible opportunity to do the work that I was called to and have it received so fully, right? Have it received so fully and I mean, it literally just felt like the world was cheering us on, and it was that way.
Yeah.
I mean, of course there was trolls that would make fun of us and all that stuff, but like, who cares, right? It was being received. And at the same time, I think our initial bullet success was also a liability, because what it came with it was, the possibility for designing our business around VC funding and building something that was going to get to X, wild amounts of money and all of this stuff. And so what we didn't do was build a scaffolded, simple way to grow a successful business. And I was having babies. We were having, my wife, well, I wasn't, but my wife was. And I started my executive coaching practice right at the same time. So actually that's how I made my money. So I made some, like a little money through Evryman, but really I had to stand up a whole entire different career in order to take care of my family in this. And it involved way too much travel. It involved, a level of sort of obsessive, hopeful energy about what we were doing. It was just a matter before it's just going to be a matter of time until the economics of it all worked out. And not only were we getting all this critical success, but of course we were just around the bend from it leading to a meaningful, sustainable sort of income, and it just didn't, you know. And so that quickly put a hell of a lot of strain on it. And on my end, you know, there was a lot of parts of being a dad, the functional parts, the pragmatic parts, right? The money parts, the um like I hadn't, I guess I got thrown into, how it felt to me is like all of
Yeah.
a sudden I was a dad with a family to support. Meanwhile, my passion is absolutely taking off. This business is taking off, but there was just sort of like this practical infrastructure that I had not. I mean, listen, like little things like had I put money away when I was, you know, had I had my successful media career, you know, basic things like that, um, would have potentially been a different story, right? But I still had a lot of immature just stuff to learn to work out, you know, and a lot of things to work out. So it was
You know,
intense.
what you guys are doing was remarkable. I think anybody who was around that time as a man, you know, above a certain age would remember it. But as I look at it now and like what we're trying to do, you know, with the company dads and how we're going about it, there is a sort of, I don't know, irony is not the right word, but there's a sort of implicit tension between, you know, doing something to support, you know, other men and to help other men connect, and at the same time, you know, being a man yourself and being a husband, being a father, if not, you know, being a provider in the broadest sense of the word. And then at the same time, with the people that you're bringing in, the people who are coming, the 80 or so people who are coming to these retreats, you know, any spouse will probably say, sure, yeah, have at it, you know, go to one of those. But if you then go to 6 of them or 8 of them, that spouse is going to say, what the hell are you doing? Like, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm not, you know, one to, my wilderness is a golf course. So I'm not about to, you know, nothing's going to attack me. The alligators are usually asleep. But like I would only take, you know, I only take maybe 1 or 2 golf trips a year, and those are like 3 days, and I line it up because otherwise there's responsibilities. How did you, you know, how did some of the men who came to Everyman work through that implicit tension? How did you yourself work through that tension as not just a dad, but a brand new dad?
Yeah, great question. I feel like that tension is, uh, yeah, to name it in my terms, it is just the shift that a man goes through when he becomes a father in terms of what responsibility actually means and what it actually looks like, right? And so it's interesting because there is both on an acute individual level, but also on a you know, societal level, generational level, men's mental health and men's just basic overall wellness is not great, right? And there's legitimate need there to address that. And that was what we were doing, was one way to go about addressing that. And it was a powerful way, right? It's the type of thing that could enact real change real quickly, really equipped men with skills to connect, you know, with their partners, with their children, with themselves, with friends, and really could wedge in a level of health and awareness and connection that was, you know, almost unthinkable prior, right? It really had that impact. But that's exactly, you know, the tension is that it takes time, it takes resources, it takes, you know, and we live in a finite. I think one of the things that, when I say that I had a lot of immaturity or lack of practicality in me, it was going from a lifestyle that felt, it didn't feel infinite, right? That's too big of a word, obviously, but a lot of freedom and a lot of room for, like, before I got married and had kids, you know, I was literally a professional at following my my passion and taking care of myself, right? And so I guess fast forwarding a little bit, what I've since left Everyman. Like, it's been 3.5 years now, so I have a good chunk of time in after that. And as I grow up and you know, understand the world and my role in it a little bit better, what I'm really curious about is how can we provide enough sort of support and uh, I don't know, opportunity for men to engage in their own mental health, in their own wellness, while not, upsetting the rhythm of life, upsetting the
Yeah.
basic sense of responsibility, right? So I mean, working at it, I'm not saying there's a perfect algorithm figured out here yet, but yeah, yeah,
One of the things my wife talks about, she works in finance. She talks about how it is much easier to be pushed out of your job than it is to jump away from your job.
yeah.
And when you're pushed, you're like, okay, I gotta figure this out. What am I gonna do now? But to jump, you're like, well, is now the time to jump, or do I wait a little bit? Is it gonna get better? What was the moment when you said, okay, I gotta leave Everyman. I gotta try to do something else. I gotta figure out whatever it is that's gonna be next for Dan.
It was the pandemic, so it was 2020, and it was on the back of, a year, maybe 2 years. I'd have to check with my wife to get the accurate read on that, but of coming up against a series of conversations where it's like, Dan, this has not been working for too long, right? And a real change needs to happen. And then the pandemic hit. We were living in Southern Canada. We actually our family did the full minimal living thing. We moved into an RV on a regenerative farm outside of Ojai, California. And we're like had some of the best years of our life doing that. But living there in the middle of a pandemic as it started and things felt very, very, very unstable and insecure, we pulled the plug. We pulled the plug on where we were living, and we drove across country and ended up buying a home here in Maine. And as part of that, also, it was just uh, things had become more and more untenable within the organization, and it was honestly, it was uh, a really hard decision to stay for a long time before I actually left. But the moment that I left was just in the midst of literally what felt like everything kind of melting down, around us. And um, yeah, it was a scary thing to let go of, but had a lot of growing up that happened because of it, I would say.
So let's talk about, kind of what's next. What was the genesis of Fatherhood Unlocked?
Yeah, the genesis. I mean, to be really blunt about it, it was in the first inception was that I didn't feel like I could like tuck away my passion neatly into a drawer and not continue to follow it. And it was also Everyman was still existing, right? And it didn't feel right to just immediately come out of the gate and go head to head and create a competing entity. And so we kind of discussed and um, a possibility of doing men's work and doing what I do best, but anchoring it toward a population that is not necessarily fully contradictory to that business, right? So that was the business end of it, but it was also just a clarifying and emerging reality for me that the work that we were doing at Everyman and that sort of traditional or straightforward men's work is really, really, really helpful. And it also tends to live out in the nether regions a little bit, right? It's like you go to this retreat or you go to a group and it's out here away from life. It's out
Right.
here that's this somewhere else, some different sort of time continuum. And with fatherhood, and I would also name for my work with organizations and executives and executive teams, is that same type of interaction and education and experience, when brought into the context of a closer into the context of real life, has a lot of benefit to bring with it, right? It's so sometimes like at a traditional men's retreat, it sort of feels like, okay, you go over here, you liberate all these new things, you have all these new ideas, but then what, right? Like how does that, what happens to those new things that are emerged? But in the context of fatherhood, we'll do a call with a bunch of dads, and what comes out of it is a very direct application or improving and deepening your bonds with your kids or taking action in your business, right? So in a strange way, it almost feels more bioavailable. It feels like it has more of a direct impact on a life, and so that's been really central part of what's central toward my shift to it. Plus, it's also um, the men's work world. Again, it's so far from mainstream, right? It's like the fringe of the fringe if you look at statistics, right? And I mean, I feel at this time somewhat even burdened by my inability to just let that go, right? Like I could just turn toward my executive career and, you know, make a wonderful living and just do all that, but I can't let that go. And the so if I am going to spend a lot of my time and energy really attempting to build something, um, it's a landscape that isn't established and mature, right? Like dads aren't investing money and time into their fatherhood, right? There's no father training. There's not many. There's not much out there. And I actually feel very strongly that with the way that the zeitgeist is changing around fatherhood and parenthood in general, I mean, you and your company, you know, is a prime example of that, right? There's a change happening, and dads are being asked and expected to show up in our families' lives in a way that my dad's generation, very few would have even known how to comprehend, right?
Right.
And so there is a skills gap, right? So if I break this down into a really simple thing, there's a huge skills gap and capacity gap in what men like me in fatherhood are both internally wanting to bring to our life and our families, and what our partners want us to bring,
Yeah.
what our kids maybe unknowingly would want us to bring, and then also just to bring it back in the business realm. I mean, I have a hunch that you know, the market space around fatherhood in a lot of ways, consumer brands and just but a lot of different ways, is changing, and that's part of my thinking as well.
If I understood it correctly, and I may be wrong, but you know, the analogy you're drawing is like, you know, when you go to a men's retreat, I think of like, you know, one of my favorite places to go in the United States is this little town north of Scottsdale in Arizona called Cave Creek, and they have
Mm.
wonderful hiking there. And you go out there and nothing. Now, every August, a whole bunch of people die because they're stupid and they go out there without water and there's nothing, and you know it's nothing. But I go in February and I like it, and you know, clears my head. It's wonderful. I've been out there. One of my daughters has come with me. We've walked and we just have a great time. But then you go home. And then you go home, and you know, there's a great book by a great short story by Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentine writer, called The Aleph. And in The Aleph, you have this moment. The Aleph is this moment of like total consciousness, total awareness of something, and it's almost overwhelming. And the person who experiences it is very concerned, and then as the days and the weeks go on, he becomes more concerned because that feeling dissipates, and it
Yeah.
dissipates slowly, until it's gone. So if I understand correctly, what you're looking to do with Fatherhood Unlocked is connect sort of this vast library of knowledge that you personally have in the men's space, in the working men's groups, but directing it toward fathers where they are, being
Yeah.
in their home with their families, going to bed too late, getting up too early, and trying to make a go of it. Is that a good summation?
It is a good summation, yeah. And part of what I've experienced, I mean, what are the avenues for supporting oneself, right? There's therapists, there you can get a coach, you can if you have sort of addiction issues, you go to a anonymous meeting. Like there's a lot of established ways to sort of find resources and support that you need, right? And I'm talking more of the internal resources there, less external, right? And what I experienced in a good, solid men's group that meets regularly is a just a sweet spot, just an absolute sweet spot of resourcing and expansion that I think comes from the peer-to-peer structure, right? To have other men that you can see yourself in, that you can understand. Uh, it just creates this, oh man, just this possibility for acceleration in so many ways, right? In terms of just healing some of your your baggage, but also in your ability to interface with the world around you, right? I remember the first Evryman group I ever started in person. We were living in Montana. I think it was 10 guys that started, and by month 3, 6 of them had either started the business they'd been waiting 10 years to start, or, changed or had the guts to ask for that big raise and that job shift. One of them decided finally to marry his, partner that he'd been on the fence. Just like there's this kind of general, I don't know, malaise or I don't know, like I don't mean this in any judgmental way, but just sort of life as it is. But in these structures that you put together, I mean, if you want to just name what actually happens, is it's guys that come together and say, hey, what's actually most important? Like what are you really trying to do with your time and your life? What are you really trying to do with your career? How do you really want to show up for your family? And you create the conditions to get actually honest about that, and you say it out. You like say it out loud, and these guys who care about you hear you say it. It just sets the conditions for taking the appropriate risks in your life, or finding the appropriate help that you really actually need. It's such a seemingly organic. I mean, obviously it takes intention to put yourself in that situation, and it takes your willingness to show up to it, but it just has a particular magic and benefit to it and listen, I am a coach, right? And I've done therapy for years, and I've done all of that is wonderful, but this is another way that I think the peer structure just really, there's just something there, and I just kind of can't let go of it. And when it comes to fathers, I feel like, so we kind of proved it out. You can go off to a retreat, you can connect deeply with these men, you can find out really what you feel and what you think and what you want. But my question is like, okay, great, so got the skill, right? I've learned that's possible. Who should I actually be doing that with? My wife, my son, my business partner, right? Like that's where it really counts. And so yeah, I think that and it is hard, right? We don't have much time left over in our day and our week. But what I'm really have been workshopping is what's like the minimum viable dose? Like how can we invest in ourselves enough to resource ourselves more fully, to have more creative space and agency, to have the friends around us that we need. And that's one of the big things here too, is that there's exceptions out there, but statistically, middle-aged men, fathers, have the fewest friends of anybody in our society. And we can sort of anecdotally feel how that sucks, but when it comes to actually being productive and powerful in our life, like, it's a huge deal, right? It's a huge deal. Like, so belonging somewhere, without question, is something that a lot of men just do not have.
Dan Doty, thank you for being my guest today on the Company of Dads podcast. One final question for you about fatherhood unlocked. And I love that that phrase unlocked. Guys who listen to this sounds good. You've touched on it a little bit, the time issue. But how, when you think of like 1, 2, 3 ways that you're going to be able to help fathers find that time for themselves to be better versions of themselves, be better spouses, be better dads, be better workers, what's the plan to sort of help those guys, work that into the day, so that's just not one other thing that stresses them the hell out, because they're not going to do that well either?
Yeah. The first is that you have to find some space in your life to slow the hell down, like really slow down and unplug from the digital world and unplug from the needs all around you. So it sounds like, golf might be your place, or Cave Creek is a place for you, but like there has to be a place to where your own internal world and truth is louder than everything else, right? So that's a start. But I think right on the back of that is that it seems impossible that doing one thing in your life would make more room for everything else. But I think that that's almost what has to happen is we need to find something or somewhere in our life that resources enough, that refreshes us enough, that recharges us enough, that that thing becomes not the burden of one more task, but that is the place to go, which sort of puts relaxant into the whole system, that creates space for clear thinking and clear feeling, and allows you to orient back into the maelstrom of life, more fully. So, I mean, it could be a group, it could be, it could be anything, right? It could be just a basketball game, it could be a hang with your buddies, it could be a quarterly camping trip. Who knows what it is, but the overwhelm, and I would just say unbreakable tiredness that we face as dads, it is possible to live this reality of fatherhood from a more resourced place, and from a place where we have this like basic okayness inside of us. And if we have the courage to go after that, it's available.
Dan, thank you again for being my guest. Everyone, check out Fatherhood Unlocked. I'm super excited for it. And again, really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.